Now, I wanted to contextualize this discussion about the retention of cultural practices and so on and so forth by African Americans in the New World by really helping us to understand what precipitated the arrival of these Africans into this space. And of course, it was slavery. I sort of, in an earlier talk, I introduced you to the circumstance that led to the sanctioning of the enslaving of Africans, the capturing of Africans from their homelands, and then taking across the Atlantic and to be then brought into the slave trade. Now, I was trying to explain earlier that slavery in itself would evolve, and slavery varied depending on the countries that were in charge of it, but it was almost exclusively driven by by money, by the economics of it. That slavery's demise came about when the risks of slavery, both economic, especially the economic risk of slavery, outweighed the effort to enslave people. The risks were just too high, and the losses were potentially too high. This is what began to dismantle slavery. The risk of slavery involves slave rebellion, slave resistance, the cost of slavery, and so on. However, I think when we come to look at the 1865, the period after the war, and so on and so forth, and the reasons why slavery was abolished in the United States, we'll begin to understand that even though that was part of the debate, there was a very, very significant part of the ending of slavery that had to do with the resistance of slavery. In other words, Africans were never satisfied, were never comfortable with slavery, and were never accepting of it. The enslaved people were constantly resisting, constantly fighting, constantly rebelling. And that meant that is why the slave system, the organization of slavery, had to keep changing. It had to be keep changing, and it turns out that that change was to be increasingly draconian, increasingly violent, and increasingly restrictive in order to maintain a system that the people who were enslaved were instinctively and intellectually and emotionally resistant to. Um, and I think this is a very important thing to consider. And one of the ways that I guess we can understand that is if we pay attention to the moment. One of the first settlements in America was Jamestown, and Jamestown was a settlement that involved the people coming in, either fleeing from persecution or from some other kind of thing, or seeking a new life, new wealth, new society, and so on. But it also involved the bringing in of enslaved people. But these people came in to a large extent as in the system of indenture. In other words, for a while in America, even though it was a short while and it was a relatively small number of people, for a while in America, what we call slavery was in fact an indentured system in which people would work for a certain period of time after being captured, and then they would be open to having their freedom. They could either buy their freedom, or they could negotiate their freedom, or they would have just a term, and then after which they could then become living citizens or individuals in the colonies. And for the early African American experience for many people was that while they experienced this indentureship, many of them would go on to be propertied people. They would go on to have an existence outside of enslavement. Now, the reason that so now things start to change slowly when in a most, not slowly but most drastically, when there becomes a distinction being made about slavery that was racially defined. In other words, if once America decided that and this is early colonial America and colonial Britain began to decide that what made a person a slave, inherently a slave, by dint of themselves, was that their race made them a slave. In other words, their de facto condition, their de facto status in society was their race. And this was very important. And this came about through a very peculiar and interesting fact about the transatlantic slave trade that it's very, very, very important to pay attention to. It seems like the most subtle and simple thing, but if we pay attention to it, we'll begin to understand just how influential and how pernicious actually it became. So just imagine that if we think of it, one of the things, the way to do it is to think about what we do with so-called prisoners, criminals, anybody that we imprison, anybody that we put in a system of imprisonment. We take away their rights, we take away their freedom, and so on and so forth. And this is done as a way to keep society safe. This is done as a way to enact punishment on those individuals. Now, when a woman is put in a prison in today's society, and it has always been this case, if she happens to give birth to a child while she is in prison, there's absolutely no question that of whether that child is also to be in prison. In other words, there's an understanding that her offspring cannot be carrying the responsibility of her crime, and therefore that child is free, and that child is understood to be free. This important detail, the detail that said that the child of anybody, regardless of their status in life, it has the capacity to be somebody else. In other words, to have a carte blanche in terms of what their future is, and so on and so forth. And this is not just a moral question, but it's a legal question. In that event, that individual can have sustenance. So the implications, of course, is that if there is value in having this woman in prison, if, for instance, there's a criminal system, a prison system in which people work for cheap labor. It doesn't cost a lot. They make things like license plates. They make a lot of cheap products and so on and so forth, and the prison benefits from it. And as you know, I'm not inventing this. There's a sense in which it is actually true that this is actually happening. What it meant is that there's no way to replenish that by the reproduction, by the birth of a new child to work in that system. That child who is born in that system, for whatever reason, is free and will not be forced to stay under that system. Well, what happened during the period of slavery, the enslavement and slavery that was first a kind of indentureship, was that very quickly it became clear that in order for many owners of these enslaved people and controllers of these enslaved people to maintain their capacity to reproduce and to produce wealth and so on and so forth, it became very clear, first of all, to racialize the enslaved person, to distinguish them from the white person, and to distinguish them racially from that person. Therefore, they could be identified as enslaved people just by dint of what they look like and the presumption of where they came from. But secondly, and more critically, that the offspring of that enslaved person was automatically enslaved. Now, this is radical. This is one of the most pernicious factors, which meant that slavery could perpetuate itself, which meant further that the replenishing of an enslaved population, a labor population, a free labor population, would not necessarily require further importation, but could require the breeding of more slaves. And so consequently, and then of course that the question of the path towards them, this offspring being enslaved, had to do primarily with, and this became the law, the mother of the child that is born. If the mother of the child is enslaved, then the child will be enslaved. And the reason why they made that law that way is that it was the simplest thing to define the origin of the child through the mother. I mean, so consequently, what happened with many of the slave owners was that they would rape their enslaved women, and their children that these women had could not inherit their freedom from their fathers because they were born of an enslaved woman. The implications of that are revolutionary, and that's what changed the New World and changed America. But that wasn't something that was existing before. That came into play over time. And it came into play over time by building systems and structures and creating laws and practices that would help retain the system of slavery, but also retain the economic force of slavery. Socially, of course, this creates all kinds of problems. If the enslaved person, therefore, becomes the property of the owner, then and of course the reproduction of the children of the owner would mean added wealth to the owner, then any kind of familial structure that would change the idea of the idea of power through inheritance and through family has been taken away from the enslaved person, removed from them, because that inheritance is only an inheritance into slavery. And this is why, in an early lecture, I said one of the great damages of slavery was the elimination of the idea of a genealogical and ancestral lineage as a part of the inscribed structure of the African American society. Of course, it wasn't successful in completely eliminating it because, of course, these societies came from ancestral based societies. And in many of these African American communities, there's that the folk memory, that idea of keeping your lineage as part of your memory. However, it did have a significant impact on an understanding of the culture and understanding of the ways that these individuals begin to understand themselves and begin to live their lives. And so consequently, if we think about it, and if we think that the body is a property, and the body is a property and it's worth something. In other words, when we look at all the books, the bookkeeping that you can find everywhere. You can find them for Jefferson and for just the average person in Boston who owned a slave or two and so on. You would see very clearly in their ledger of their assets, for instance, would be a carriage, a donkey, two slaves, and some land. These would have value. These would have value, and these could be inherited. These could be sold in order to meet debts. And if we think about it, it seems simple enough to say, I will sell a slave. But these slaves were children, in many instances, of women and men who may have lived on the same plantation. But of course, one of the things that they faced was that at any point, the owners of this property who saw this as their assets, their value, at any point they could sell that slave, regardless of paternity, regardless of familial loyalties or anything like that. And this happened again and again and again. That was the norm in enslaved societies. And this was the radical construction of slavery as a valid thing. And ironically, while the Catholic Church endorsed the system of slavery, very soon even Protestants began to endorse the system of slavery, invoking the Gospels, especially not even so much the Gospels, but the letters of Paul, where he says, slaves, obey your masters, amongst other things, as a way to argue that the slave system still existed. One of the great myths that was then constructed around the Bible and around slavery was to presume, therefore, of course, with the need to create a justification that was that could be scriptural. There was a need to create a justification that validated the enslaving of African people. Even to this day, there are some who propagate this notion that the Bible actually had the view that African people were the sons of Ham. These are the sons of Noah, were the offspring of Ham, and therefore they were going to be, as the book of Genesis would argue, the hewers of wood and the fetchers of water. This is not historically or spiritually or biblically accurate. There's no explicit connection between that idea of the sons of Hams being people of African descent and so on and so forth. But this became one of the great myths and the great narratives that supported the idea of slavery, and was perpetuated by so-called well-thinking people, well-meaning people during slavery, and arguing that. Well, think about it. Christianity begins as a belief system, finds a way to support and to endorse the enslavement of people. And yet, to justify it, it says that it becomes therefore a mechanism by which they can Christianize these African people by ripping them from their homeland, bringing them into these new countries and these societies, and making them slaves. There was no return after slavery. Slavery existed. Forms of slavery did exist in Africa, but those forms of slavery did not exist in places in which there was a impassable ocean separating them. That if somebody was captured and put on a ship and brought to the Americas, there was a rare possibility and almost impossible to imagine them ever going back to Africa. This is different from somebody in Ghana who is enslaved from one tribe to another tribe, and literally they're walking distance from each other. They can return, they can meet other people, and so on and so forth. The very scale of this system, this really, really sophisticated and complex system of human degradation, destruction, and violence, is just something that is hard to comprehend. And the only way to maintain that system was through actual violence and by way of the fear of violence. These are things I'm saying, but of course they're fully documented by the enslavers who carried out the task of enslaving people, documented by writers of that time, and documented by even the current debates within the United States Senate, the United States Congress, even during the period in the beginning when there was discussion about the ending of the Revolutionary War, and later on in the debates around the Civil War. In Britain, in Parliament, there were debates for over 30 to 40 years before the ending of slavery that discussed these matters and wrestled with these matters. And while all of that was happening, there was the incredible history of death, destruction, genocide, and violence that characterized that period. We'll be back with more.